the Art Center's Art for Lunch. And this time around, we're going to talk to Julianna Souther. She's a recently graduated photographer, right?
Yes.
Multimedia artist.
It's kind of moving on.
Right.
Yes.
And she has a very, how should I say, it's a very important subject, of course, for her, but it's also something that we should talk about in the theme that the Art Center is doing this year about being brave. And I think your artwork is very brave. And we'll get into that later. But I'm just going to ask questions, and you're going to answer me. And if the audience has any question, please feel free. Your question is more important than mine. Okay, Julianna.
Yeah.
What is the title of your show?
Okay, the title of the show is Mementos of My Korean Self. Do you want me to explain?
Yeah.
Okay. The reason why it's called that is compared to my solo show that was in the fall from being an OSU student as my graduating show. That one was called Breaking Misconceptions. So the misconception of being assumed a certain kind of identifier. For instance, I am sometimes assumed as Chinese from the way I look, I guess. My skin's a little darker, and Korean skin is usually a little lighter, a little paler. And so there is that misconception, and the misconception of identity as being an adoptee and also an Asian American, and just being an American. There is that crossover, intermixing of identities there. And for this show, I want it to be solely based on my experiences, not necessarily the adoptee community like I did with my solo show in December. So this one is more central to the things I think about, not necessarily the things of all adoptees, but it is part of the project as well. So it's a bit of both, but more personal and about me.
Yeah, so your identity, your being is very important for your art making. How does your art making how does that being inform your art making?
Well, I think of the way I process and make work on my discoveries of who I am as kind of like people go to therapy sessions, and from those consultations with their therapist, they will give them a task to do before their next visit. They write down what you ate that day until the next meeting. So in that similar kind of clinical daily task, I'm using my art practice as a way to potentially journal my thoughts, my feelings of who I am. But I think in this visual and research-based way, it also helps me to visualize, because I'm doing it in real time, taking these pictures, researching about these different terms that I'm still learning as an adoptee and Asian American and American citizen. So all this knowledge and that I learned from researching, talking with others that are more informed than me, helps my practice and how I can better structure and create these different projects that are interlinked with my identity.
Mm-hmm. When did you start this very, intentional journey?
For me, that's a little wishy-washy. And we call that phrase coming out of the fog. And one of my first, my final for my first photography project at OSU. It's entitled that because that's essentially what you're asking when I actually realized or came to feel that I was adopted, even though I think in my subconscious I probably did know. But for me, it was, I'm gonna say in the summer 2018, my parents told me about this camp called Hope Camp, which is part of the adoption agency that I was adopted from. And after going to that camp and meeting some other adoptees, I came to the realization that there is a community of adoptees locally in my area, in Corvallis and in just Oregon, and even in the whole world. So that was really eye-opening for me. And then starting that project, coming out of the fog, and actually pushing myself to create something that I felt was like beyond me, was really inspirational and really put a drive into the work that I'm doing now and continuing to doing. And so that's how it all pretty much got started, from that one project and then going on forward.
How was that to find a new community?
It was
an additional community, I should say, because you didn't leave your so-called old community.
It's very different, kind of surreal in a sense, or like when you're waking up from a dream kind of feeling. That's how I think of it. And I think of it as just like anyone else in the community, but we're most, I think, closer connected since we're all can relate to each other, the experiences and emotions that we have in a certain situation with other people in our own communities. So there's that, but we're all just the same. So it's just, I'm glad that I could find a community that's based on identity, and I can use them as a resource for support and just to learn more about myself.
You mentioned that your parents encouraged you to go to a camp. Was that specifically for Korean adoptees or for international?
International adoptees, because they have grown since I started learning about Holt International, and they have now grown to adopt in, like, I think Africa, let's say Germany. They started to branch way out, and I think it was mostly central in like Korean adoptees or Chinese adoptees, which is very popular. One of the pictures that is in the gallery, it is a picture of my friend who was a U of O, a student, and she is a Vietnamese adoptee, and that's less common to see, I think, especially on the East Coast. I heard from another adoptee that they are more common on the East Coast, which is kind of interesting. So there is a bit of, I guess, kind of like migration, different types of adoptees in different places. So that was really cool to find out.
So let's talk about how you connect this with your artwork and your chosen medium. Why did you pick photography as your means of expression?
Well, I started out in photography, and so I'm more knowledgeable in how to execute and compose a good photograph. So I stuck with that medium because of that, and just the possibilities and the way of storytelling you can see through photos, and especially if you think of documentaries and how they compose and think about where they want their subject to be to express a certain emotion or response from the audience. So I think it does a really good job of showing that raw emotion of the subjects and of what it's talking about. And if you think about the text and descriptions that go along with it, it really enhances the project in that way. And so that's how I started out with photography. But I consider myself as a multimedia artist because I'm liking going outside of the photographic lens, if you will, and using like book arts, which I really enjoy creating books, which still use the skills of photography and like digital manipulation and all that, but it also has that hands-on ability that I really like. And so I've been thinking of using also drawings and video and sculpture could possibly play into it too. Yeah.
And do you have plans for any of the other media that you just mentioned?
I really do like sculpture. I took one class at OSU. I really enjoyed it. So I'm still thinking of what to do with that medium. But yeah, I think that would be a really fun one to try next and incorporate into a new sub-project is what I call these, even though it's an ongoing project. I call them sub-projects because it touches on slightly different topics.
So would you say that your photography is slightly more of a documentary? It's leaning to a documentary style.
Yeah, I would say that it is more, documentative approach there. As the video can show you, it is a documentary, and it's about people and not just any old subject that is fun and happy. And there are happy moments, of course, in adoption. But yeah.
And so, do you see possibilities of translating that documentary bent that your work has to sculpture, or?
I have thought about it. I do know there are some adoptee artists that I have now made connections with their work, and they do have some sculptural pieces that are about adoptee and their identity and their experiences, which I found really interesting. There is one of them, I think it's like something to do with the process of hair, and way back when cutting your hair was like a taboo no-no because they want to keep your natural hair because it's sacred to them and like their culture. And so she snipped her hair and she had it on display in a gallery. And they also had a video installation of showing the process of someone braiding their hair and then cutting it off, and then just that repeated process. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, so it's interesting to hear how you would translate that into something else. You mentioned research.
Yes.
Because you are an adoptee out of Korea doesn't necessarily mean that you know everything about Korea.
Yeah.
As by osmosis or something. So tell us a little bit about how you go about doing that research and what it means in your work.
Sure. So for, let's say, the documentary, that one was a lot of research-based work. So first I made a Google Sheet, which just had asking simple information and then some questions like you were doing with me, and then they would answer it both in written form so I can see it, and then later on we schedule an appointment through Zoom, and then on that day we go through the same questions. They introduce themselves so I get a feel of who they are, and then we just talk about these questions and like how it affected them. And that topic is specifically adoption trauma, and that is a very heavy concept and something that's always going to be part of an adoptee's life, about how to deal with mental health and the things that are maybe external and not related to adoption, or if it is, there's a gray line between that. And so I took that project and interviewed them, and after that, I saved that recording, and that's what you would see in the gallery. And I also include myself because I thought that would be relevant and a good chunk to add in there. And it's all different topics. And so if you're watching the film, it will go through a little introduction, and I added a post from an adoptive mother giving her experience about adopting a child and what it's like, and having to think about, okay, what kind of struggles will they have to go through when they get older? Because I don't think adoptive parents think about that a lot. And then down the road, when they're old enough and they want to learn about their culture and like about their file, Korean adoptee or any adoptee always has a file usually. Sometimes they don't. I know in like China, they may not know a lot about them because sometimes their name is actually the place that they were dropped off at. So there's that mystery with their identity there. So it's really depends what agency you're from and I guess who you go with, who adopts you. And so there's a lot in play with that. And from researching the certain ideas for like the questions, like I wasn't sure what kind of questions I should ask and what the terminology would be. So I had to do a lot of research about that. Like one of them, generational trauma. I didn't know about that until I looked it up, and I actually talked to one of the adoptees who was like a mental health consultant, or they were in the adoption system, so they were a social worker. So they told me a lot about that, which was really nice to hear from them and to just talk to them like regular human beings, not just for a project. So that was really great experience doing that beforehand and then having that experience while making the film.
I read out of what you, or I hear out of what you're just saying that international adoption is quite a bit different from national, if that is a term, adoption. Adoptees probably always wonder where they're from, but international and different, meaning basically different races would have another layer to that. How is it to be an American?
As we call it, it's kind of like whitewash, which is that you have the American identity because you grew up here, but you may not look American depending where you live or how your personality conflicts with the American dream, I guess. And so it's really depends on the kinds of conversations you have with people. And so if they bring up, okay, so where are you from? That one's kind of a confusing one for us because we're like, okay, do you mean where we're currently living or where we were born? So we always have to pose that other question to gauge what they are meaning. So it's kind of hard for us to really define if we're American or we are adopted birth country, you know, are we Korean, are we from China? So which one do we really like see ourselves fitting in with and we see it as true to us? So it's hard to know, and depending on what the conversation is, then we might switch from one or the other.
Yeah. But you're also having to straddle this not really being a Korean. And anyway, what was the most appealing thing that you learned about Korea while you were doing all the research for your artwork?
Well, I did get the opportunity to study abroad with some OSU faculty and other art students in 2019 in August. So that was really interesting because I actually got to live there for a little bit and see what their culture's like compared to here in the US. And so it's not hugely different, but there is definitely, feels like they're more futuristic, like they're way into the future than we are, which is kind of cool to think about. And as for how it relates to my experiences in going about these projects, I think it helped me to open up and see really what Korea is like. Because we're always thinking, what is our birth culture actually like? You see these pictures with these films, but it doesn't really show you what it's like when you're actually there. So that was really nice to actually get my feet in Korea. And yeah, I think the process of just finding others that can relate and learning more about myself really is, I guess, the high point of making these projects. And yeah, just seeing.
Was this group art students, or was this group Korean Americans?
These were art students.
Okay, so it was just a coincidence that you were American Korean.
Well, the professor that was leading the trip, he was from Korea. So he definitely showed us around the local places that tourists may not know of. So that was really cool to, yeah.
So what would it mean for you if you didn't have art to use and to help you on this journey of trying to find what your identity is about?
Okay. So if I didn't have art, I think if I still had the community that I connected with, online mostly, I would probably just reach out to them. They used to have these adoptee Zoom calls, we like to call them, every week, and just to help with, COVID, and just to have a community together in a somewhat face-to-face interaction, and just getting to know them, and just outside of the adoptee identity and perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, maybe something like that, or doing some more research, watching some films to be more familiarized with my culture.
Are you happy that you have the art to have as a tool?
Yeah.
A tool?
I would say yes. Yeah.
But when you picked art as your subject to focus on in college, you weren't thinking about that journey yet.
No, I wasn't.
So why did you pick art?
Well, my family's already kind of art-oriented. My older brother, he is a ballet dancer in Eugene, so we did a lot of ballet or performing arts growing up. So we would travel some places because of a competition or a workshop, or because one of my siblings was doing one, so we would attend those events and that kind of thing. And the performing arts is a total different kind of art than the visual arts. And yeah, I think that's how it started. I just grew up doing it and let's continue this cycle.
What do you remember your first time that you said that you thought to yourself, yes, I can do this, and photography is my focus?
I actually wasn't sure what medium to choose when I decided on art. I was still on the fence about it when I first started college, so I just did the regular, general credits, and then there was this art class, and so I took it because we needed it, and I really liked it. And I also did photography in high school because our neighbor took it, and I thought that was really cool. And so that's also, I think, how it got me into doing art here and creating these works. So,
so you created very different looking things for this show. It's not a large number, but they look very different. How did that come about?
well, since the solo show was pretty heavily focused on my photography, I wanted to add in other mediums that I really enjoyed, like printmaking, for instance. And so I wanted to see how that would look and would be organized in with my photography on the walls. And I do like it how there's some compare and contrast with them. That one image in there that's a printmaking print. It's called Korean Dress, and it's a wood block print where you have these carving tools on the wood block, and then you carve away, and whatever is carved away, it becomes white space. And so that's the part that you don't ink, and then whatever is left will be black and white image. So basically, I wanted to have something like that because, I don't know, it has this kind of traditional kind of taste to it that I really like, and it pays tribute to the journey I am on currently, and still reconnecting and learning about history and stuff. So I think that ties in well. And also the accordion book, which are scans of pictures of me and my foster mother. And I did on purpose calling it Picturing Her because I don't really know if that's her or not. That's what they say, but they could have lied at the adoption agency because they don't always tell you the full truth. So, yeah. And so I thought that was a good sequence of how I possibly lived before being adopted.
Yeah, it's funny how nobody really has memories going further back than 3 or 4 years old. So those first years are, although very important, not consciously known to us. So it is a strange gap. There's a really big photograph of a tiny little subject. So tell us a little bit about that.
So that one is called What is Sarang? It's
Can you say that again?
I think it's right, Sarang or something. It's a Korean bird. I'm probably butchering it. My Korean is not too good, but it's basically
It's better than ours.
I had to research, and it is this tiny bag. It is basically like maybe as big as your pinky. It's a little trinket, and I got it from this Korean woman when I was in Korea. And she offered it to me, and it was because of to make pregnancy rights, I think, in Korea, because oftentimes, unwedded women that get pregnant, it isn't very favorable there. They're very stingy about that, and that's what often leads to adoption. And so with that little trinket, I had this project at OSU. One of my classes, we had to take a picture using one of our 4x5 cameras. It's those big clunky cameras where it has the little veil. You go under it and you use the clicker to take the picture. And so that one was very tricky because I don't know if we get a good photo or not. I'm glad that one turned out. And so I had my brother who was adopted too. He's from China. And so he held his hand out and he put the little object on the front, and then I took a picture of the camera in this way. And we also had a studio light so we can actually see all the creases in the hand and the little bag. And the little bag has these stripes, and it's just black and white. You can't really see the color, but it's blue, white, and red. And those colors represent this like old traditional Korean dress, the hanbok, is what they call it. And they often use that same color design for bags. In this bag in particular, they use silk. It's very, very favorable back when. And as I read, it was different thicknesses of the silk for each little strip, which was very interesting to me. And I also heard from that fabric, they cut it down for children to wear it's their pom-pom dress, or for men, their suit, their pants and vest. And by cutting it, it potentially wards off evil, is what they think. And so I thought that was also really fun to hear. And it also pays tribute to the history that you probably won't learn about in a textbook, really, because it's so specific. And so I thought that was interesting and how that also ties into graphic art and the history that has as well. And
So, what do you find challenging in your process?
I guess sometimes articulating what I'm actually thinking can be a really hard one for me. But also composing and getting the idea out onto like paper, onto a picture, how I want to put everything, why it should be there, why it should be this time of day, or that kind of thing. I think that is the most challenging. But once I have all the components, all the materials ready, it becomes very exciting seeing it actually come to life.
What is your most satisfying part of your?
I think it's when I hear people are really empowered by the work. Like I know my professor, Julia Bradshaw, she was really interested in, she actually became my mentor for the BFA show, my solo show in December. And so she was really impacted by my work, which I find really nice to hear from another person's point of view, because again, I don't know how other people view my work. And so it's great to see outsiders that are not adopted to really understand the struggles and also the achievements we have made with adoption and how people are thinking about identity, different identities. Yeah.
So your audience that you have in mind when do you have an audience in mind when you're making artwork?
I do. I think generally it is for the adoptees in like our community, but also for non-adoptees, so they are aware of these kinds of thoughts and experiences that we have that sometimes isn't translated well at all, especially in the media. And yeah, for instance, that portrait of my friend who's Vietnamese, that one started because something, I think it was in January 21, the South Korean president gave a speech on the Chinese New Year, and he incorrectly assumed or misspoke about adoptees because he thought that to help the system, and so families can be still together. He thought that, okay, if you adopt a child at one point, you can change your mind and take it back to the agency, which we thought was horrible. And that came about a campaign called Not a Thing, because we felt like we were thought of as commodities, objects.
You're not a bread toaster.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's what came out of that project. And so these kinds of miscommunications, I think, is why I want to have my audience be people that aren't adopted.
So is there something very specific you want to tell us?
I guess just
Other than all those things that you have already told us.
yeah, I guess just being mindful of how you talk to a person, making sure they're comfortable with what you're saying, even though it could be a completely normal thing to say, and to another person it could be crossing the line. So I guess just paying attention, making sure the person you're addressing is comfortable with those questions and things you have to talk with them or about them. And so, yeah, just
I think that question, where are you from, is one of those loaded questions that are being asked without the intention of being loaded. I get that question asked a lot too. But I know that some people find that a very upsetting question. Could you talk to that?
Yeah, I haven't personally find it too offensive, depending on the tone that they say it, and I guess who's saying it. Like if a little kid said it, it wouldn't upset me because they don't know any better. But
They're just curious.
exactly. I mean, I'm sure adults are too, but I guess the way you say it and from, I guess, the how the conversation started and then the question being added to it, how that translates to an adoptee's, mind, and they're thinking like, okay, what are they trying to get to? And so there is that too. But I do know some adoptees are a little more sensitive to that kind of question because it's asked a lot, and a lot of times it tends to be a little racist. So finding somewhat of a fine line between the way you say it and like with what context, I think would be like some good advice.
I think the context is probably very important in that. Does anybody in the audience would like to add something or ask something of our? I have 1,000 questions that I think are too personal and not appropriate to ask or even ask here. So, is there anybody else who wants to know a little bit more about Julianna and her artwork? I would recommend people to really go and see it because it is powerful, and I think your choice of medium of photograph is a good one for now, and we'll see what you do further. I would like, you have questions?
Well, I was going to say, my question could kind of grow from what you just said. You talked a little bit about narrative.
Yes.
And photography and narrative kind of going together in your work. And so I wonder if you do start doing more sculptural parts of this project, sculptural parts or drawing parts. So how would that maybe change the narrative, or how would you then think of narrative?
Right. One way I've thought of it is maybe taking the photographs, so some of them touches on stereotypes within just being Asian, another ethnicity than Caucasian, or being adopted. So there's kind of two sides of the coin of that one. And so for that piece, I would probably actually have maybe 2 sets of clothing, maybe on a mannequin. Okay. And that's why I originally asked for the models to bring 2 sets of clothing, one that identifies them with their culture, that from their adoption, when they're adopted, and then the culture and outfits that they're more comfortable in that signifies they are American, they're their true self, they feel comfortable in their skin. And so maybe having something like that to connect it with. But that's just one way I've thought about it. But
Yeah, and again, I have 1,000 questions, but I'm going to ask there's another one in the audience.
So, yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question, but it's about the kind of work that you do, like the photography and documentary.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see getting that work out there? Like I was thinking, because when you come into a gallery, you know, you kind of walk around and look at the things,
Mm-hmm.
but there's more to your pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you see just having the documentary running all the time, or how do you see presenting them so that people, you know, can really get into it and take the time? It's kind of the,
Yeah.
it's not the usual thing that you see in a gallery, so where do you know, present and show work like yours?
Yeah. So I do think the documentary is one that you could sit on, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, to just really gauge what they're saying. Even if it's a snippet in between the film, you can still gain quite a lot from what they're saying. And yeah, as for like how the gallery should operate with my work, I think, yeah, it's in a way like an in-person slideshow kind of thing. You look at the work, you kind of think about what's being said with the text, but it's also supposed to just get your gears going and think about each word and like, how would you apply this to your life, right? If you were in their shoes, that kind of mindset.
And when you're doing the documentary, do you keep that in mind, that, you know, people may not stop and listen to the whole you know, documentary, the way you present it will get people's attention? Do you think about that under, or is that something?
I haven't really, but now that you say it, I think I did, yeah. Yeah, I just want them to take away something from it, something that this is significant and it does happen. Even though adoption has its own little story, there's more to it in the background, right? Than just, oh, okay, if I can't give birth, you know, like how people usually do, and going through adoption could be my second choice. But just to be aware that there could be some other things down the road with that child that you need to be aware of and to make sure you can take care of their needs that they have.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, Juliana, you mentioned that you felt that a lot of adopting parents didn't necessarily think through the baby stage or the elementary school stage, and then are confronted with other, for them, maybe unexpected problems when their adopted child grows up and gets different challenges that they may not be able to identify with, or maybe they will. You know, that's probably different from one set of parents to another set of parents, assuming that we're talking set of parents.
Right.
Is there anything you would like to add to what we've been talking about your artwork?
I think I've said pretty much what needs to be said, but yeah, if there's any other follow-up questions,
Then I'll go to my infamous last question, which is, if money and space was not something you would have to think about, what artwork would you like to own? And the owning part means a certain amount of commitment. It's not, I'm not talking about owning as a capitalist construct, but as that part of commitment. Both are true.
It is a tough one.
It is a very difficult question. It's surprisingly difficult. Well, as Julianna is thinking, is there anybody in the audience who would like to respond to this question?
That's a neat twist you have on the end of it, though. The owning rather than the capitalistic.
Oh,
The owning as part of it.
yes, and one artist at a certain moment responded with saying, I don't think it should be owned, I think it should be shared with a lot of people, so I don't want to own anything. But I feel that there are different ways to look at it, and that bit of commitment is important. You own a piece of artwork because you acquired it. I'm not talking about gifts that you received and now have to put under the bed or anything. No, something that struck you and touched you, and how do you want to have a relationship with that artwork? That is actually the type of owning I want to go for. But can you think of anything, Joanna?
I do, like when I was making the documentary, I was thinking of Bill like Viola's work, his like installations, like they're like very, very slow on purpose, but they're super long. And so it kind of makes you want to see if there's an end to it, but it's like continuous, infinite. And so I really like how carefree they are, even though they might have like a sad undertone. I don't know if I necessarily would want to own it, but I guess I would have it in a space, like maybe a living room, and just have it as like a background. Kind of like background music, but through art.
Well, I would like to thank you for being an artist, making brave art, and being on this journey and sharing it with us. Keep going. I think you have places to go. I would like the audience for listening to this talk that is traveling to very personal to more general topics that definitely you're giving us something to think about, which is one of the things that art should be doing. Good job.
Thank you.
So thank you all.